Picture a life built on routine, on the familiar soil of a family farm. A life of hard work, shared purpose. Now imagine that life just shattering. One Monday morning, 5 members of a seemingly ordinary family simply vanish. They don't pack. They don't tell friends. They just flee, leaving behind their identities, their connections, and a home filled with a silent, creeping dread. They're running from something so terrifying it made them abandon everything. But what? This isn't a thriller movie plot. This was reality for the Tromp family in August 2016. Their escape spiraled into a 5-day nationwide mystery, a desperate flight fueled by an unknown, unseen fear. What could make an entire family seemingly break from reality all at once? And how does that kind of shared terror even start? The Tromp family, Mark, the 51-year-old dad, his wife, Jacoba, 53, and their 3 adult kids, Rihanna, 29, Mitchell, 25, and Ella, 22, seemed like the picture of rural stability. From their red carrot farm and earth-moving business in Sylvan, a quiet spot on Melbourne's edge, they'd built a connected life. They lived together, worked together, their days intertwined with the land and their businesses. By all outside appearances, they were a normal, hard-working Aussie family, grounded and doing well. But on Monday, August 29, 2016, that normal picture just crumbled, alarmingly fast. Without a word to anyone, the whole family piled into Ella's silver Peugeot SUV and drove away from their lives. This wasn't some organized getaway. It was a flight. Left behind in their sprawling farmhouse were unsettling clues. Passports, credit cards, bank cards, and most of their phones. The front door was unlocked, the house a mess, like someone had been frantically searching for something. Yet, weirdly, there were also neat, organized piles of financial and business records. It was a scene of contained chaos, of meticulous paranoia. The only phone not left behind was Mitchell's, but it didn't last long. Just 30 kilometers into their journey, near Warburton, Mark, convinced they were being tracked, ordered Mitchell to toss it out the car window. Digital breadcrumbs had to be erased. The family was officially off-grid, hurtling into the unknown, all because of Mark's deep-seated fear that someone was out to steal their money, maybe even their lives. Mitchell later said his parents were fearing for their lives. This wasn't just a spontaneous road trip. It was a desperate escape from a phantom enemy. The question hanging heavy in the air, unspoken but definitely there, was what or who were they running from? Police would later confirm they found no evidence of any actual threat. No deaths, no extortion attempts. The terror, it seemed, was all in their heads, yet devastatingly real to the Tromps. One investigator called it the most bizarre case I've seen in 30 years. So the journey began. 5 people in a car, surrounded by a shared invisible terror. The destination? Unclear. The purpose? Even more so, beyond just the basic instinct to flee. They drove through that first day and into the night, covering hundreds of kilometers, putting distance between themselves and the life they knew. But as the miles piled up, so did the strain, the paranoia, and the first cracks in their collective escape. The unspoken fear that had united them in leaving would soon start to tear them apart, one by one. As Ella's Peugeot sped north, away from familiar Victoria and into New South Wales, the vibe inside the car got increasingly tense. Mark and Jacoba's paranoia, which started as a frightening but maybe manageable force for their adult kids, began to escalate. Mitchell, the 25-year-old middle child, found himself in an impossible spot. He'd joined the trip, he later said, mostly to keep his family safe, a reluctant passenger caught in the bewildering storm of his parents' growing delusions. Being told to ditch his phone near Warburton was a stark sign of how convinced his parents were that they were being watched, hunted. For Mitchell, who reportedly stayed the most grounded through it all, this must have been deeply unsettling. a forced cut from their last real link to the outside world, to potential help, to sanity. He was, as one account later put it, the only person in this entire story who was just completely sane. The relentless driving continued, fueled by this overwhelming fear. They drove through the first day and night, pushing on until they reached Bathurst, a town in New South Wales, about 800 kilometers from their sylvan home. The journey was likely filled with Mark and Jacoba's anxious pronouncements, their twisting of everyday things into more proof of the danger they believed they were in. For Mitchell, the pressure became immense. He was watching his parents, the pillars of his life, fall apart in front of him, succumbing to what looked like an inexplicable and terrifying break from reality. Their behavior, he'd later state, became increasingly delusional and hard to tolerate. On Tuesday, August 30th, in Bathurst, Mitchell made a decision. He couldn't do it anymore. The fear wasn't his, and the logic of their escape was unraveling. He chose to leave his parents and sisters, to break away from the suffocating paranoia that had swallowed the family. This was no small thing, to leave his family under such bizarre and distressing circumstances, with no money and no clear idea of what was really going on. He had to find his own way back, to navigate his return to the world they'd so abruptly left. His departure was the first big split in the family. It showed his strong grip on reality, but it also left Rihanna and Ella alone with their increasingly distressed parents. Mitchell started the long journey back to Sylvan, using a series of trains, a young man trying to make sense of a completely senseless situation. He'd get home the next morning, Wednesday, August 31st, to find a very different reality waiting for him, a home swarming with police and the family scattered. His escape wasn't just physical, but psychological, a desperate attempt to reclaim normalcy in the face of overwhelming irrationality. His parents and sisters, though, were still on the road, heading deeper into the heart of their shared mystery. With Mitchell gone, the remaining family, Mark, Jacoba, Rihanna, and Ella, pressed on. Their silver Peugeot now carried an even heavier cloud of fear and uncertainty. They drove towards the Jenolan Caves, a popular tourist spot in the Blue Mountains of New South Wales. The choice of destination, if it was even a conscious choice, remains as murky as everything else. These magnificent, ancient caves, a place of natural wonder, were about to become the backdrop for the next stage of the family's breakdown. For Rihanna, 29, and Ella, 22, the situation was getting more and more alarming. They'd seen their brother decide to leave, a clear sign that the threat their parents kept talking about wasn't something he believed. Now, alone with Mark and Jacoba, they were face to face with their parents' worsening mental states. The pressure, as Mitchell would later call it, the buildup of normal, everyday events that had somehow twisted into a terrifying story of persecution, was clearly taking its toll. Sometime that Tuesday, at the Jenolan Caves, Rihanna and Ella made their own desperate decision. They too chose to separate from their parents. The exact details are pieced together from various reports, but it seems like it was more out of necessity than rebellion. Noticing their parents were not well, and perhaps fearing for their own safety, or simply unable to take the psychological strain anymore, the sisters decided they needed to get away. In a move that spoke volumes about their desperation, and maybe their own confused state, they reportedly stole a car, a ute, to escape. Their plan was to drive towards Goulburn, and then eventually home to Melbourne. Their journey together, however, didn't last long. After reaching Goulburn, a town about 2 hours south of the Jenolan Caves, the sisters themselves split up. They stopped at a petrol station, and that's where their paths diverged. Ella, the younger sister, later said her main concern was to get home to feed her horses, a poignant, practical thought in the middle of all the chaos. It was a small anchor to the normalcy they'd lost. She took the stolen vehicle and started the long drive south, back towards Sylvan, back towards the life they'd fled only days before. Ella would be the first of the Tromp family to be officially found when she arrived back at the family farm on Tuesday night, only to find police already there, alerted to the family's strange disappearance. She explained to them that her parents felt something was wrong, that they were terrified someone was out to get them. Rihanna's experience took a much more disturbing turn. After partying with Ella in Goulburn, her state of mind seemed to get significantly worse. For 2 days, nobody knew where she was. She must have been wandering, alone and disoriented, in the bushland around Goulburn. Then, on Thursday, September 1st, a local man driving his ute made a startling discovery. After driving for nearly an hour, he pulled over and found Rihanna in the back of his vehicle. She was in what he described as a catatonic state. She didn't know her name or where she was. The terror and confusion of the past few days had completely overwhelmed her. Rihanna was taken to Goulburn Hospital and admitted for psychiatric care, a deeply distressed young woman caught in the terrifying grip of a shared family crisis. Police later indicated she wouldn't be charged for the stolen vehicle because of her mental state at the time. The once ordinary family road trip had morphed into a series of individual flights, each member battling their own version of the fear that had set them on this bewildering path. With all 3 children now gone their separate ways, Mark and Jacoba Tromp were alone, 2 figures adrift in a landscape of their own escalating paranoia. They were still in Ella's silver Peugeot SUV, a vehicle quickly becoming a mobile symbol of their bizarre journey. From the Genelin Caves, they started driving south again, back towards Victoria. Covering some 600 kilometers, their movements were erratic. Their destination seemed to be nowhere in particular, just a general flight. On Wednesday, August 31st, near the Victorian town of Wangaratta, the parental unit itself fractured. Mark and Jacoba became separated. How exactly they parted ways remains one of the many murky details of this whole saga. Did they argue? Did one simply wander off in a state of confusion? It's unclear. What we do know is that Jacoba then headed north again, an incredible journey of some 350 kilometers, by means that are still a mystery. How did she travel without a car, money, or ID, all while clearly distressed? Did she hitchhike? Walk for miles? The records are silent on this particular leg of her ordeal. The next day, Thursday, September 1st, Jacoba Tromp was found. She was discovered wandering the streets of Yass, a town in New South Wales, far from where she'd separated from Mark. She was agitated and disoriented. Concerned locals called the authorities, and Jacoba was taken to a hospital in Yass. Later, she'd be transferred to Goulburn to be closer to her daughter Rihanna, as both mother and daughter began to receive mental health treatment. The terror that had driven her from her home had now left her stranded, alone, and deeply distressed, hundreds of kilometers away. Meanwhile, Mark Tromp had stayed in the Wangaratta area. His behavior became increasingly bizarre and worrying. There was a particularly alarming incident where he was reported for dangerously tailgating a young couple who were out playing Pokémon Go. The couple said Mark's vehicle was so close they couldn't even see his headlights. When they pulled over, Mark stopped behind them, got out of his car, ran into the middle of the road, stared at them intently, and then abruptly turned and fled into nearby Marawa Park, disappearing. Shortly after this unnerving encounter, Ella's Peugeot SUV, the reluctant chariot of their strange odyssey, was found abandoned in Wangaratta. The keys were still in the ignition, the doors unlocked, another echo of how they'd left their home, as if ready for a quick escape, or maybe just abandoned in a moment of overwhelming panic. With Mark now on foot and his whereabouts unknown, the search intensified. There were reports of break-ins at a local motel in Wangaratta around this time. Someone had apparently forced their way into a room, used the bathroom, maybe slept in the bed, and left behind a Wesley bar wrapper. Police dusted for fingerprints, suspecting it might have been Mark, desperate for shelter and food, but it was never definitively confirmed. He was a ghost in the machine of his own making, a man fleeing a nameless fear, now being hunted by concerned authorities and a bewildered public. The prosperous farmer from Sylvan was now a fugitive from his own mind, lost in regional Victoria. By Thursday, September 1st, what started as a puzzling family disappearance had blown up into a full-blown interstate manhunt that absolutely gripped Australia. The names Mark and Jacoba Tromp and their kids were suddenly all over news bulletins and front pages. The sheer weirdness of their actions, ditching a successful life, leaving behind all ID and communication, and the bizarre, piecemeal reappearances of the children, fueled a national obsession. Police forces in both Victoria and New South Wales were now heavily involved, trying to locate the still missing Mark and piece together the fractured timeline. The media swarmed Sylvan, painting pictures of the idyllic farm left in disarray, and descended on the various locations where family members had turned up. The case was a journalist's dream and a detective's nightmare, a mystery with no clear motive, no credible external threat, and a cast of characters whose actions justified logic. On this same day, Mitchell and Ella Tromp, both back in Sylvan and having spoken with police, made a televised public appeal. Looking understandably strained and worried, they pleaded for any information that could help find their parents, especially their father, Mark. Mitchell tried to explain the core of the mystery, saying his parents had been fearing for their lives and that this fear had driven them to flee. He described it as a buildup of different, normal, everyday events, just pressure, and it slowly got worse as the days went by. It was a tantalizingly vague explanation, hinting at mounting stress, but offering no specific trigger for such an extreme reaction. Ella added her confusion, saying, "I still feel confused. Mom and Dad's minds weren't in the best places." Their appeal humanized the unfolding drama, showing the faces of the children caught in this psychological whirlwind, desperate for their family to be whole and safe again. The public's imagination was completely captured. Theories were flying around on social media and talk radio. Was it a cult? Were they into something criminal? Had they been exposed to toxins on their farm? The tech-free family road trip, as it was quickly nicknamed, became a national talking point, a kind of Rorschach test for people's own anxieties about modern life, mental health, and the pressures that can crack even the most seemingly stable families. The story was irresistible. A prosperous, normal family suddenly unmoored from reality, embarking on a desperate, bizarre flight across state lines. Every new detail, every strange sighting only deepened the intrigue. The search for Mark Tromp became the focal point of this national drama, the final piece of a bewildering puzzle. The community resources poured into helping them were significant, something Mark himself would later acknowledge. The search for Mark Tromp had become a desperate, widespread effort. He was the last family member unaccounted for, the presumed epicenter of the fear that kicked off this whole bizarre saga. After ditching Ella's Peugeot in Wangaratta, following that strange tailgating incident, he'd effectively vanished on foot. Police, media, and the public were on high alert. Sightings were reported, though many turned out to be false leads. He was described as being most convinced of the paranoia, and his continued absence was a serious worry. For several days, Mark remained elusive. He was somewhere in regional Victoria with no money, no phone, and likely in a highly distressed and paranoid state. Authorities were checking various leads, including the reported break-in at the Miller's Cottage Motel in Wangaratta, where a room had been entered, the bathroom used, and a Wesley bar wrapper left behind. While they suspected it was Mark, it couldn't be confirmed at the time. He was, for all intents and purposes, a man on the run from phantoms, a ghost in the vast Australian landscape. Then, on Saturday, September 3rd, 2016, 5 long days after the family had inexplicably fled their Sylvan home, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. Mark Tromp was found. A passerby spotted him walking alone on Greta Road near the Wangaratta airport, on the outskirts of the town where he'd last been seen. He was reportedly dehydrated but otherwise physically okay. The man who had led his family on a 1,600-kilometer journey fueled by an unknown terror was now in police custody, he was taken to the Wangaratta police station. As he was later driven away by his police officer brother, who'd come to help him, Mark Tromp, perhaps overwhelmed, maybe resentful of the scrutiny, or still in the grips of his ordeal, gave a defiant middle finger to the waiting media photographers. It was a raw, unfiltered moment that spoke volumes about the stress and confusion of the preceding days. Mark was questioned by police and underwent an assessment by a mental health officer. He was then released into his brother's care. Later, a more composed Mark Tromp would release a statement expressing his deep gratitude to the police and healthcare professionals who had assisted his family. He apologized for the hurt and concern caused by these events and acknowledged the burden their situation had placed on community resources. With Mark's discovery, all 5 members of the Tromp family were accounted for. The immediate crisis, the frantic search, was over. But the mystery, the profound and disturbing question of why this had all happened, was only just beginning to be unraveled, or perhaps, more accurately, to settle into an enduring enigma. Ella and Mitchell expressed their immense relief, with Mitchell saying he was jumping for joy, and that it was going to be the best Father's Day. Ella said she would probably cry when he returned home and then send him back to work, something Mark himself was reportedly keen to do. The desire for a return to normalcy was palpable. Yet, the shadow of those 5 days would linger long after. With the entire Tromp family found, the immediate focus shifted from a missing persons case to a massive psychological puzzle. How could a seemingly normal, hardworking family of 5 all suddenly dive into such a state of paranoia and go on such a bizarre, self-destructive journey? The leading theory, and the one that seemed to best fit the inexplicable events, was a rare phenomenon known as shared psychotic disorder, or Folie et Famille, an extension of Folie et deux. Basically, shared psychotic disorder is when symptoms of a delusional belief, and sometimes hallucinations, get passed from one person to others. It usually involves a primary person who initially has a psychotic disorder with delusions. This person then imposes these delusions onto one or more secondary people they have a close relationship with. These secondary folks usually don't have a pre-existing psychotic disorder and often come to accept the primary person's delusions as reality. This is especially true if they're in a dependent or very tight-knit relationship and are pretty isolated from outside opinions that could challenge the delusional beliefs. Once separated from the primary person, the delusional beliefs in the secondary partners often fade or disappear completely. The Tromp family situation had several factors that lined up disturbingly well with Folie et Famille. First, they were an incredibly close-knit family. Mark, Jacoba, and their 3 adult children not only lived together on their Sylvan farm, but also worked together daily in their family businesses. This constant closeness could create an intense, insular environment where one person's skewed perception of reality could more easily influence the others. Second, their shared financial and emotional investment in the family businesses meant their lives were deeply tangled. Mark's reported fear that someone was out to steal their money could have hit a particularly raw nerve within a family whose livelihood was so collectively built and maintained. The piles of financial records found at the house suggested a frantic attempt to secure or understand their assets in the face of this perceived threat. The sudden start of the crisis also fits a pattern. If Mark Tromp, who was widely thought to be the primary person experiencing the initial psychosis, suddenly became acutely paranoid and fearful, his family's first instinct would likely be to trust him, especially if his fear was expressed with intense conviction. Mitchell's statement that it was a buildup of different, normal, everyday events, just pressure, and it slowly got worse as the days went by, hints at a gradual escalation. Maybe Mark's anxiety slowly ramped up, and then crystallized into what felt like an undeniable threat. Police acknowledged they were looking at this psychological angle. An internal memo circulated among New South Wales police reportedly warned that the family might be suffering from group delusional schizophrenia, though this was a preliminary internal note, not a formal diagnosis. However, Mitchell Tromp, in his public statements, denied that his family suffered from a diagnosed shared mental health condition before the incident. It's worth noting that shared psychosis often happens in individuals who don't have prior histories of significant mental illness, especially for the secondary members. The kids' varying reactions also offer clues. Mitchell, who seemed to resist the delusion most strongly and left first, could be seen as having a stronger psychological boundary or maybe a greater connection to external reality. Ella also separated and wanted to get back to her routine, suggesting her induced beliefs were less dug in. Rihanna's catatonic state, however, pointed to a more severe impact, a profound psychological distress from the ordeal. Jacoba, found wandering and agitated, also showed clear signs of significant mental strain. Mark, the last to be found and the one who reportedly kicked off the flight out of fear for his life and money, showed the most prolonged and intense signs of paranoia, according to the story. While shared psychosis is still the most compelling explanation, other theories were briefly floated, though none seemed to fit the facts quite as well. Was there a genuine, even if unproven, threat? Investigators found zero evidence of this. Could it have been an intense fear reaction in some family members, not necessarily a full psychotic episode, triggered by one person's actual psychosis? This is a more nuanced version, perhaps, but still points to a shared, overwhelming psychological event. The idea of a staged event was also thrown around by some in the public, but as experts pointed out, the family had nothing. Mark Tromp's discovery brought the 5-day active search to an end. But for the Tromp family, it was just the start of a long, tough journey back to some kind of normal. Mark and Jacoba, along with Rihanna, needed hospital care and mental health support right after. Mitchell and Ella, while physically okay, were left to deal with the confusion and trauma of what they'd seen and been through. Legally, there were minor issues. Ella was initially charged with car theft for the ute she and Rihanna had taken from the Jenolan Caves. Rihanna faced potential charges for the same thing. However, these charges were eventually dropped in early 2017, with authorities acknowledging the extreme and unusual circumstances of the mental health crisis that had engulfed the family. Sergeant Mark Knight of Monbuk Police stated, "The family is relieved. Ella can move on with her life now." The family pulled back from the intense public spotlight, trying to heal in private. They returned to their Sylvan farm and gradually got back to work. In an update months later, Sergeant Knight mentioned, "I spoke with her brother Mitchell last week, and he said the whole family is back to work and doing really well." Rihanna, in a rare interview about 9 months after it all happened, said that the family was all happy, healthy, and just trying to get back on track again and get over everything that's happened. She also confessed, "We are all very embarrassed. We didn't want to be famous." The family business even scaled back its public-facing stuff for a while, stopping Pick Your Own Berries tours and taking down their website, likely to protect their privacy and recover away from prying eyes. Despite getting back to daily life, a full public explanation for the bizarre events of August 2016 never really came, at least not in the detailed way the public and media might have hoped, and perhaps it never could. The nature of such a deeply personal psychological crisis, especially one involving shared delusion, is inherently complex and tough to explain, even for those who went through it. The family, understandably, focused on their recovery rather than public statements. Mark Tromp, in his initial statement, apologized for the concern caused and thanked authorities, but offered no specifics about the why. The nickname Tech-Free Family Road Trip, while catchy, kind of downplayed the profound mental distress at the heart of the story. It was less about wanting to disconnect from technology and more about a desperate flight from an internal terror that had, for a time, become their shared reality. Even now, years later, the Tromp family mystery endures as one of Australia's most bewildering modern psychological dramas. Several key questions still linger, their answers likely known only to the Tromps themselves, or perhaps lost even to them in the haze of those terrifying 5 days. What exactly was the pressure or everyday events that Mitchell mentioned had built up? Was there a specific financial stressor, a personal conflict, or a health concern that acted as the initial spark for Mark's paranoia, even if no external evidence supported it? Why this specific fear of being tracked and having their money stolen? While persecutory delusions are common in psychosis, was there anything in their life that might have unconsciously shaped this particular fear narrative? How did the delusion spread so effectively? And why did it hit each family member to different degrees? What were the exact dynamics inside the car as the fear took hold? What was Rihanna's experience during the 2 days she was missing alone before being found in a catatonic state? And maybe the biggest question of all, how does a family so seemingly grounded, collectively detach from reality so suddenly and so completely, only to eventually return? The Tromp case is a stark and unsettling reminder of how fragile the mind can be, the powerful influence of close family dynamics, and the terrifying reality of shared psychotic disorders. It shows how quickly the familiar world can warp into something alien and threatening when the mind itself becomes an unreliable narrator. The unknown fear that propelled them on that desperate journey across state lines may never be fully understood by the outside world, but its impact on the Tromp family and on the national psyche that watched, transfixed, remains undeniable. The Tromp family's journey is a chilling reminder of how vulnerable our minds can be. What are your thoughts on this baffling case? Do you think shared psychosis was the main thing, or could there be other elements we haven't thought about? Share your theories and insights in the comments below. And if you've stumbled upon other perplexing mysteries of the human mind or unexplained events you think deserve a deeper look, please let us know. The Tromp family's harrowing 5-day odyssey in August 2016 is more than just a sensational news story. It's a profound and unsettling peek into the complexities of the human psyche and the powerful, sometimes risky, nature of family bonds. A successful farming family, pillars of their community, inexplicably unraveled, fleeing an enemy that existed only in their minds, yet which had the power to completely dismantle their reality. Their journey wasn't so much across a physical landscape as it was through the terrifying terrain of shared delusion, a rare but recognized phenomenon where one person's psychosis can become contagious within a closed, intimate group. The unlocked doors, the abandoned phones and passports, the frantic driving, the individual breakdowns and bizarre sightings, every detail paints a picture of a collective slide into acute fear and paranoia. While the family eventually reunited and tried to rebuild their lives away from the glare of public fascination, the questions around their tech-free road trip still echo. It serves as a compelling case study in how stress, isolation, and complex family dynamics can, under extraordinary circumstances, lead to a crisis that defies easy explanation. The Tromp mystery forces us to face the unsettling idea that the line between sanity and delusion can be more fragile than we like to think, and that even in the closest of families, unseen pressures can lead to an inexplicable breaking point. The unknown fear that haunted the Tromps on their journey into the heart of rural Australia ultimately reflects the deeper, often unacknowledged, mysteries that lie within the human condition itself. Their story is a somber meditation on the unseen forces that can shape our perception of the world, and the terrifying speed at which that perception can shatter.